Life as a Roman slave was the kind of nightmare you don't wake up from. It was like waking up every morning knowing your entire existence is just someone else's property. No rights, no freedom, just you hoping today isn't the day your master wakes up in a bad mood. If you were a Roman slave, odds are you didn't exactly choose the gig. Most slaves didn't wake up one morning thinking it was the day they sold themselves to unpaid labor. No, most were dragged into slavery the hard way, and by hard way, I mean really hard. War was the biggest culprit. Every time Rome won a battle, they fought like they were getting paid per sword swing. Thousands of prisoners got packed up like souvenirs and shipped home as slaves. Julius Caesar alone brought back 500,000 Gauls after one campaign. That's 500,000 people just gone. Like an entire country got Control-C, Control-V'd into slavery. Wild. Imagine one guy turning an entire country into his personal labor force. Piracy was another fun way to lose your freedom. Pirates back then didn't only steal gold, they snatched people off boats and sold them in Roman markets like they were selling knockoff sandals. One minute you are trading olive oil in the Mediterranean, the next you are shoveling manure for a Roman senator. And if you thought crime was bad, Roman justice didn't believe in second chances. Nope. You mess up and your career options suddenly narrowed down to die fast or die slow. Criminals were condemned to slavery, not the cushy kind either. Then there were the debt slaves, people who were so broke they volunteered for slavery just to survive. And if you were born to a slave mother, forget it. You were a slave before you even knew what walking was. Roman law made sure you inherited your mom's social status, like being born into a terrible family business you couldn't quit. Now, being a Roman slave wasn't some one-size-fits-all nightmare. Your fate depended entirely on what kind of work you ended up doing. And let me tell you, there was a big difference between polishing silverware and hauling stones until your arms gave out. Domestic slaves were the lucky ones. These were the cooks, cleaners, and tutors, basically the ones trusted to hang around the villa without accidentally setting the place on fire. They weren't exactly living the dream, but at least they got to sleep indoors most of the time. Agricultural slaves had it worse. These poor souls were treated like human livestock. They were chained together, fed just enough to stay useful, and expected to work from sunrise to sunset. One Roman farmer even said, "A good slave is like a good ox. You work them hard and you feed them less." Real motivational speaker, that guy. Mining slaves was a death sentence. The average lifespan in Roman mines was brutally short, not because they were weak, but because no human body could survive being treated like a jackhammer. They spent their days breathing toxic fumes, dragging stones through tunnels, and praying they would make it to bedtime. Most didn't. Then there were the skilled slaves, educated Greeks who became teachers, doctors, or accountants. Sounds fancy, right? Well, they still had to answer to their masters like everyone else. You could be the smartest guy in the room, but one mistake and you were right back to scrubbing floors. Another slave category was the gladiators. They were like ancient influencers, except instead of posting selfies, they were fighting lions for entertainment. Sure, you might get famous, but honestly, fame doesn't mean much when you're missing an arm. Finally, there were the state-owned slaves. They were basically the government employees of the slave world. These guys maintained roads, aqueducts, and public buildings. The pay was non-existent, but hey, at least they weren't being chased by tigers. And then there were the odd jobs, the kind of roles you don't usually think about when you imagine slavery. For starters, pregustator. Pregustators, they had one job: taste their master's food for poison. If they lived, the stew was fine. If they died, well, guess we're ordering takeout. I would complain about my job, too, if every lunch break felt like a game of Russian roulette. Then there were nomenclators. Their whole job was to follow their master around at parties, whispering names like a walking LinkedIn notification. Imagine being hired just to stop your boss from embarrassing themselves at parties. And some Greek slaves even worked as subcontractors, using their skills to take side gigs for extra cash. It was like their side hustles as a slave. Hustle culture really is older than we thought. I'll be honest, if you were a Roman slave, waking up every morning felt less like starting a new day and more like losing a bet you didn't even know you made. There were no alarms, no snooze buttons, just your master yelling, and if you weren't already moving, well, you would feel their disappointment. Mornings for these poor souls were brutal. Domestic slaves had to be up before sunrise, scrambling to prepare breakfast, sweep floors, or, if you were really unlucky, wake the master's family. And trust me, waking up a Roman noble wasn't just shaking them and saying, "Rise and shine." No, you had to quietly hover like a medieval ninja, because if you woke them too loudly, well, let's just say you might end up cleaning the latrines as punishment. Meanwhile, agricultural and mining slaves had no such drama. Their morning routine was simple: wake up, start working, and don't stop unless someone physically drags you away. Some were chained overnight just to make sure they didn't get any ideas about running off. And if I tell you about the food they ate, well, Roman slaves weren't exactly hitting up the Mediterranean diet. Meals were mostly stale bread, watery porridge, or whatever was scraped off the master's plate. It was less dinner and more survival snack. Where you slept depended on your rank in the misery chain. Domestic slaves usually crashed in kitchens, attics, or hallways, anywhere they could curl up without being stepped on. Meanwhile, field and mining slaves were shoved into ergastula. It was a dark, cramped barracks that smelled like a barn and felt like a prison. Well, they were in a prison. As for relationships, forget about it. Marriage was banned for slaves, but that didn't stop some from forming unofficial partnerships, not that it mattered. Slaves had no control over their family, none. Your spouse or your kids could be sold off at any time. One day you're sharing a meal with your family, the next you're watching your child get loaded onto a wagon, never to be seen again. There were no goodbyes, just gone. If you're thinking, that sounds bad, let me make it worse. Roman slave owners didn't believe in subtle punishments. Mess up once and you were feeling it. Beatings were the Roman version of a coaching moment. Spill wine? Beating. Break a dish? Beating. Blink at the wrong time? Yeah, probably a beating. But the violence didn't stop there. Runaways were branded like cattle, sometimes right on their forehead, and rebellious slaves could be flogged until they could barely stand. And if you really pissed off your master? Crucifixion. Yep. Romans saved one of the most agonizing deaths imaginable just for runaway slaves or rebels. For the slaves who tried to run but got caught, there was a special kind of humiliation that used iron collars. These metal rings were engraved with messages like, "I have run away. Hold me. When you have brought me back to my master Zoninus, you will receive a gold coin." Imagine walking around with a lost dog sign on your neck. That is what Roman slavery was, a system designed to break your body and your dignity. Now, if you're thinking the government had some rules to protect slaves, yeah, no. Roman law wasn't exactly a beacon of compassion when it came to slavery. Slaves had zero legal rights. If your master decided to beat you for coughing too loud or just because they were in a bad mood, that was completely legal. Roman law literally called slaves instrumentum vocale, which in simple words means talking tools. Not people, not servants, just objects that happened to breathe. I don't know about you, but being treated like a sentient mop sounds pretty soul-crushing to me. And if a master got murdered, even if it had nothing to do with you, guess what? Every single slave in that household was executed. Yeah, Romans didn't believe in innocent until proven guilty. Their policy was more like, if one of you did it, all of you are going down. Now, to be fair, And I'm using that term lightly. Rome did eventually introduce a few minor protections. For example, slave traders were required to disclose if a slave had any medical conditions or flaws, which sounds helpful until you realize that they were basically reading out product defects, like they were selling secondhand furniture. In later years, slaves were technically allowed to file a complaint if their master was excessively cruel, but do you really think a Roman court was going to side with a slave? Not likely. But some slaves did manage to escape this nightmare, not by running, because that usually ended with you getting branded or crucified, but by earning their freedom the hard way. Some slaves managed to buy their freedom by saving up whatever scraps of money they could. Other slaves were gifted their freedom. It was rare, but it happened. Usually, this was a reward for years of loyal service or some heroic act that impressed their master. Basically, you had to work so hard that your master couldn't imagine life without you, and then somehow convince them to let you go anyway. For those lucky few who earned their freedom, there was a special ceremony called the Cap of Freedom. It's like you stand before a judge and they place a special felt cap on your head to symbolize your new status as a Roman citizen. Sounds uplifting, right? Except, even after all that, former slaves weren't exactly treated like royalty. They couldn't hold political office, and in most cases, they were still obligated to work for their former master for several days a year. Like, you quit your job, but are still being called in to cover weekend shifts for free. Toxic. And no matter how wealthy or successful they became, freed slaves carried the stigma of being former property. It didn't matter if you owned a business or had more money than half the city. To some Romans, you would always just be that guy who used to belong to so-and-so. Now, if you're thinking Romans just accepted slavery without a second thought, that is not entirely true. Some Romans actually did question the morality of it. Philosophers, like Seneca, believed that treating slaves like disposable tools was, well, pretty awful. He even wrote that masters should treat their slaves with kindness because, and I quote, "we are all slaves to something." Deep stuff. Almost sounds like he invented self-help books before self-help books were a thing. But honestly, most wealthy Romans didn't read Seneca and think, wow, I should really be nicer to my slaves. No, they were too busy flexing their wealth like ancient influencers. Owning slaves wasn't just about labor, it was a status symbol. Rich Romans collected slaves like they were Pokemon cards, bragging about how many they had. Some nobles had hundreds of slaves and they flaunted it like they were showing off a new sports car. One guy had over 400 slaves in his household until one of them murdered him. Ouch. If you're thinking, what happened next? Well, the Romans, being Romans, decided that to punish one killer, they would execute all 400 of his slaves. It was like punishing an entire football team because one player fumbled the ball. Now, if you think with all that brutality, slaves would have been too exhausted to rebel. Nope. Turns out some of them had enough rage left to fight back, and when they did, they didn't hold back. The biggest rebellion was the Spartacus Revolt, and honestly, if you have ever heard the name Spartacus, you know this wasn't just some minor protest. This guy turned a slave rebellion into an army with over 100,000 followers. Imagine 100,000 furious people with pitchforks, torches, and a grudge. Yeah, that is enough to give any empire a migraine. At first, Spartacus's crew wiped the floor with Roman forces. They stormed cities, wrecked estates, and basically made Rome look like it was losing to its own workforce. For a minute there, it seemed like they might actually win, but Rome wasn't about to let a bunch of ex-slaves rewrite history. The general was sent in, and after a brutal campaign, Spartacus's rebellion was crushed. The aftermath was not pretty at all. Rome crucified 6,000 captured rebels along the Appian Way, which is a 120-mile stretch of road that was basically turned into a highway of horror. It was Rome's way of saying, don't even think about trying that again. And yet somehow, some slaves survived. Some even found ways to rebel quietly by dragging their feet during errands, messing up chores on purpose, or spreading false gossip to stir up drama. Small victories, sure, but in a world that saw you as property, any win was worth something. I can't imagine what it must have been like to live every day knowing that one wrong move could get you beaten or worse. Despite Rome's brutal grip on slavery, the system didn't last forever. The downfall didn't happen overnight, though. See, as Rome stopped conquering new territories, their endless supply of war captives, also known as free labor, started drying up. Fewer battles meant fewer prisoners to be forced into slavery. And Rome, being Rome, had to panic fix the problem. So they introduced manumission laws. These are the rules that made it harder for slaves to earn their freedom. Over time, slavery slowly morphed into something closer to serfdom, where peasants worked the land but weren't technically property. Don't get me wrong, it wasn't great, but at least they didn't have to worry about getting sold off like livestock anymore. By the time the Roman Empire finally crumbled, slavery as they knew it had faded into history. I'll be honest, the more I read about Roman slavery, the harder it is to imagine how anyone survived it. It constantly reminded you that you were nothing more than property. No voice, no rights, just a breathing tool for someone else's comfort. It's easy to admire Roman achievements, the architecture, the culture, but remembering the people who suffered to build that world, that is just as important. If these stories hit you like they hit me, I would say take a moment to reflect. And if you want to hear more of those forgotten stories, well, you know what to do. Like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for watching.